Russia is advancing quickly in the east, and they're on the verge of taking a strategic city, but some Russian analysts think it's a trap. There's concern on the Russian side that this is all happening too fast, that Ukraine is too quick to announce withdrawals, that something else must be in the works. Turning to one of those Russia analysts, Telegram channel, Vernam Regnum, says, quote, "Could this really be the collapse of the front that we have been waiting for so long? I would like it to be so, but experience does not allow this thought to take hold of my mind. There is some kind of catch here, and we are not the only ones who think so." In fact, there are two other Russia analysts that I'll be quoting throughout today's video that are also pretty nervous about this rapid advance in the east. Now, to set the stage, I think it's important to go over the recent Russian progress in the east, specifically around Pokrovsk, and why the area they're advancing into is so important. Now, I'm going to be using two different maps in today's video. Both of these will be linked in the description below, starting with Deep State map, and later I'm going to move over to Suryak map. I think both of these have their own advantages and disadvantages. Now, to give you an idea of the map we're looking at here, the green area is territory that Ukraine, that was initially taken by Russia in 2022, since liberated by Ukraine. Obviously, a lot of this up north and in the northeast. The reddish purple areas here in the Donbass, as well as Crimea, is territory taken by Russia in 2014. And then this orange, light red areas that take up a good chunk of the screen is territory taken by Russia inside of Ukraine since 2022. So the area we're going to be focused on primarily today is here in Pokrovsk. It is this bulge now poking out in the eastern portion of Ukraine. Now, I'm going to start the assessment here looking at some recent work by a Ukrainian analyst and former military officer named Tataragami. I'll link all of his work in the description below. Very reliable resource, in my opinion. And he starts by saying, essentially, you can't understand Pokrovsk and what's happening here without understanding Avdiivka, which is a town that fell to Russia in February of this year. He says the goal of the operation was not merely to capture Avdiivka itself, but to gain access to the operational space behind it. Once Avdiivka was secured, it provided the Russians with multiple options and maneuverability. And you can see that here with roads branching out north and west, and you can see how Russia has a lot of options to kind of move then on eventually Pokrovsk. So it makes sense. He says, since the fall of Avdiivka, Russian forces have advanced more than 25 kilometers westward into Ukrainian territory. Starting from July, the rate of Russian advancement in this region has accelerated, allowing them to bypass multiple defensive lines that Ukraine hastily constructed after the fall of Avdiivka. Now, the reason I like Deep State Map is that we can choose a date and go back to see what the lines looked like at this point. So I want to go back to around, say, February 18th when Avdiivka fell on or about the 18th. We'll close this so you can see how different the lines look, right? There was still fighting going on in the western edges of Avdiivka. That was just 6 months ago. This is a relatively rapid advance for this war. If we move forward to July even, and this is when he's talking about how the advance has really accelerated in recent weeks. Again, there's still a pretty significant bubble before they get to Pokrovsk, and then moving to today, you can see how much of that terrain has since been taken by Russian forces. I'm going to pull up another map here that's put together in the Tataragami article that'll be linked. This one's from the Blackbird open source intelligence group, and they mapped out Ukrainian defenses visible through satellite imagery to help kind of visualize the situation of the Russian advances towards Pokrovsk. And I think it shows here a pretty good idea of where some of the fortifications have been prioritized and how some of these were hastily constructed after the fall of Avdiivka to try to do whatever Ukraine could to slow the Russian advance. Of course, one of the concerns in this war or any war is when a main line of defense falls, what do the secondary and tertiary and so on lines of defense look like? Generally speaking, they're not as robust as that initial line, and it kind of looks like that might have been what happened in and around Avdiivka. But there's more to it than just that. Tataragami goes on to say, quote, while there have been many discussions and concerns about the lack of fortifications behind Avdiivka, which are entirely valid, the major issue remains the shortage of available manpower and units to defend those positions. And the reason, or one of the main reasons that people point to about the lack of manpower in the Pokrovsk direction right now is because a lot of those units were apparently redeployed for the Kursk operation further north. In fact, this was kind of reiterated by the top Ukrainian military officer, General Syrsky, recently, who said, I should note, that they have now taken over 1,295 square kilometers of Russian territory and about 100 Russian settlements in Kursk. But he said one of Ukraine's main goals in launching the Kursk incursion was to divert Russian forces from critical areas of the front. and there's no area more critical right now than Pokrovsk. Unfortunately, he mentioned that Russia is not withdrawing forces from Pokrovsk, but instead focusing its efforts there, saying Russia has instead transferred around 30,000 troops from reserves and other areas to reinforce the Kursk direction. So if one of the major reasons for kicking off the Kursk operation was to slow the Russian advance near Pokrovsk, it didn't work and maybe even backfired because the Russians are moving faster in that direction now than they have in a long time. Now, one of the Ukrainian units that could be called upon to plug the gap here or elsewhere is the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the Bradleys. If you think of the video a couple months back where a Russian T-90 got shredded by Bradley, that was the 47th. This is a unit that is regularly called upon to redeploy to some of the hottest sectors of the front, and right now, they need our help. They need our help in terms of Kazovac vehicles, helmets, body armor, optics, and drones. So I'm going to do what I can, and I hope you'll join me in helping these warriors who are in the fight day in and day out. If you'd like to donate, I've set up a donor box account where we're working towards a couple Kazovac vehicles for the unit. That is linked in the description as well as the pinned comment below. Now, one of the reasons I've been hesitant to do this in the past is because fundraising is such an easily manipulated area, and there really are scams around every corner. So to mitigate that, I'm going direct to the unit. There's no middleman, and I'll be sharing receipts, pictures of equipment purchased, and testimonies from the soldiers of the 47th, confirming that these funds arrived and purchased exactly what they needed. I know asking for any money is a big deal, so please make sure that you've got your personal and family obligations taken care of first. If after that you still have something set aside, I hope you'll consider this effort. Now, I'll be donating 100% of the AdSense from this video after taxes. Unfortunately, got to pay the man. But this fundraiser actually started on TikTok and X yesterday and blew up pretty quick. So if we exceed the goal, that'll just mean more or better quality vehicles for the 47th. I'll also be running these on a monthly basis, depending on their needs. So a new one is going to be set up at the beginning of September. That one probably focused on drones. But look, I'm excited to do this together. So let's get after it. Now, turning to why Pokrovsk is so important, I'm going to go over to Suryak map, which the benefit here, there's not a time lapse, but it does look like it's more recently updated. In fact, there's some areas over here in Pokrovsk where Russia has recently shown evidence that they have moved into some of these areas, and that's not yet updated on deep state maps. So I think it's more relevant for this part of the conversation to use Suryak. The reason that Pokrovsk here in the middle of the screen is so important is it is a rail hub and essentially a key logistics intersection that supplies much of the eastern and the southern front. Turning back to Tatarigami, he said, when assessing the situation, we should remember that Russia doesn't need to capture Pokrovsk to gain control over the railroad. Mere proximity to the town enables Russian forces to target trains and vehicles with artillery, mortars, and drones, effectively rendering the railroad hub unusable. It's highly likely the train operations in the town have already been suspended due to these risks. And we'll zoom in here a little bit to show where that railhead is. Of course, right in the middle of the town here. You see the rail line. And to his point, just a couple miles out of town, the Russian forces at this point, that is well within range. It's unlikely that Russia has mortars and artillery, heavy artillery, moved right up at the front line of advance, but entirely possible that they have light mortars, and then the artillery can just move up behind them and start to hammer Pokrovsk, again, taking this supply line completely out of operation. He says, quote, the potential loss of Pokrovsk poses a serious operational threat to the logistics of the entire region, disrupting supply lines from Volodar in the south to Hrivka in the north. The loss of both the road and railroad would exacerbate the situation for Ukrainian forces in the Donbass, leading to the potential losses of places like Volodar and both the north and south of Toretsk. So we're going to zoom out here. This doesn't take a military strategist to figure out, or a logistics expert. You can see the Pokrovsk area here with multiple roads coming and going from the city. When you zoom out just a little bit, again, seeing the front line here in orange, this is Russian-occupied territory, you can see how if this hub is lost, all of a sudden it really threatens Ukraine's ability to effectively supply everything from, take your pick down here, probably Volodar, all the way up, Marinka, of course, Hrivka, Toretsk, possibly all the way up Chasiv Yar in this area. You can see a major swath of territory here that is at risk of not being able to be effectively resupplied should Russia take Pokrovsk. So, war is fluid. It's very hard to say, one area is more or less important in terms of falling to Russian forces or being liberated. But Pokrovsk is pretty clearly very, very important. Now, let's jump into this trap conversation, and this is something that I'm always kind of hesitant around. I mean, every time one side or the other in this war has advanced, we generally hear people throw out there that it's a trap, and in reality, it's rarely ever worked out in the way that people think. So a couple different Russian analysts here are concerned about this, and I think it's worth running through exactly what they have to say. The first one here, Evgeny Norin, said, quote, "It is known for sure that the Ukrainian armed forces have several very not battered, more or less decently equipped units in the rear, 5 brigades. If they do not throw everything that moves into the battle near Pokrovsk, it means that A, they intend to introduce reserves somewhere else, and B, they must produce some kind of devastating effect faster than the front in Donbass collapses completely. And by the way, they have not yet used aviation, the F-16s, for example. If in any case they do not use operational reserves in the Donbass, it means that they are saving them for something else. But if the enemy is obviously not an idiot, and at the same time he behaves inexplicably strangely, then there is some explanation. He just does not want it to be on the surface." It's a pretty valid point. There are units of the Ukrainian military that are essentially unaccounted for right now. They haven't been pushed into Kursk, and they haven't been deployed to Pokrovsk, so what's the plan? Got to think they're going to be used somewhere, and that's kind of what this guy is hitting on here. The second one, Ilya Janssen, says, quote, "I don't like the fact that the Ukrainians are retreating so easily. It is also shouting at the top of his voice about the failures and that Kursk was simply a distraction from other directions. In those areas we are now successfully advancing, the Ukrainian is literally surrendering key cities to us, leading reserves away. But it seems that the enemy has resigned itself to military defeat and decided to act in a slightly different way. If I am right, they will concentrate not on defending their territory, but on inflicting increasingly painful blows on us, both by military and terrorist methods. In general, I'm not as happy as you guys. Over the years, I've already learned not to underestimate the enemy." Now, throughout this war, what we're kind of used to at this point are heavy battles over every little settlement, and progress has meant, maybe dozens of meters a day, if anything at all. So how many times can you remember has there been a debate for a week or more about a single settlement, of who actually holds it? But for some reason, that's not happening here. Ukraine is rapidly retreating, announcing that retreat and talking about how their real focus was up in Kursk. The Russians noticed that too, and they're taking note. Now, a couple things here to keep an eye out for going forward. The most expected course of action has to be that Ukraine won't let Pokrovsk go without a significant fight. And what that probably means is the redeployment of certain units to the Pokrovsk axis with the goal of slowing the Russian advance, or at least making it incredibly costly. Think of, digging in, making this a slugfest from one building to another, similar to what we saw in Bakhmut and or Avdiivka. But we have to keep in mind these Russian concerns that something else is coming. But now we're getting into pure speculation, but a few thoughts worth mentioning here. The first is that there could be a counterattack in the Pokrovsk Bulge. I'll pull that map back up to show where this could take place. As Russian forces advance, they become more and more exposed, and it does stretch their logistics. This is why counterattacks work in the first place, and it could be something that Ukraine attempts in and around Pokrovsk. The second is maybe a push somewhere else entirely. Ever since the Kursk operation kicked off, the Russian sources have been worried about a second offensive coming somewhere else, like Kherson, down here, Zaporozhye, up here, or maybe even in Crimea. Again, these alternatives are just pure speculation at this point. Nobody saw the Kursk operation coming in the first place, so it's pretty safe to assume we're not going to be able to predict whatever the next phase is very easily at all. But that's all I got for now. For anyone interested in helping to support the soldiers of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, check out the link in the description below. This is something that I'm genuinely really excited to do with you all. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.